Welcome to Beyond the Session, the show where your therapist gets a turn to hold the talking stick. Here's our little snappy intro from ChatGPT. Unlock the therapy vault and hear what therapists really think once the door closes. And I gotta admit, I never would have come up with that on my own. Our show is brought to you by Reset Counseling and Psychotherapy in Barrie. We're a small team of therapists whose passion is to see you get unstuck and come truly alive. We're doing a 2-part series on narratives. And Lindsay, I think this is probably why you got into therapy in the first place. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but you love stories, both telling and hearing stories. What do you think it is about stories that are so powerful and compelling for you?
I think that stories are the things that capture our imagination, right? And you know me because I'm a very imaginative person. So your imagination really shapes who you are in many ways, right? So I think that, facts and figures are good for one function, and stories are good for capturing the heart.
Yeah, and this is something that has kind of characterized you from the time we met. I remember 15 years ago in university, and you were putting on these cafe events where we were talking about stories and what it is about stories in movies, for example, that makes people want to pay $10 to go watch it. What is it that really sparks our imagination or draws at our heartstrings?
Yeah, I've heard of this explanation once where they're talking about this story of these tribesmen who are around the campfire listening to stories about the predators or the tigers out there that they have to face. And part of what the stories do is it actually gives you like a practice, as like a rehearsal for real life. So you get to face these struggles and these conflicts and get emotional and spiritual strength in some ways to face the realities and the complexities of life.
Yeah, I like that. That kind of reminds me of my time that I spent in Indigenous communities in the far north, right? And the sense of how the oral traditions are passed on from generation to generation, and that becomes the history. And this is our identity. This is who we are. This is the meaning that we've made for ourselves. And some of those oral traditions, for example, I remember how there was this river rushing through the middle of town and, not safe for kids to play around it. But the story that even the children tell me is that there's this great big frog that lives under the water. And if you go near the water, then the frog's going to get you, kind of thing. So this is a story that people have told their children, and it's a technique for promoting safety around the water. But I think it's a more fun way to do it, right? It's bringing that imagination piece into it.
I think it's just wired, right? I hired a professional storyteller to a school one time, and it was everyone's favorite event. The youngest children to the oldest to the adults, all sitting around captured by this professional storyteller. So it's just really, it's really powerful. Like you just from a young age, that's what children crave, and I think that's what adults actually crave too. It's part of why, when people's lives get too mundane or too comfortable, they create drama. Is because they're looking for story, really. They're looking for something that's a conflict, something that they can fight for.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, there's something deep in our soul that longs for good to win and evil to lose. And that kind of helps us to carry on in the days where it feels like we're on that hamster wheel and, we're just kind of doing our routine. I think what stories do is take experiences and then it turns it into an episode instead. You think of the folklore of battles and the actual battle is probably very horrific for the people in it, but then in the folklore it's about the bravery and the courage and a guy hopping on his horse and slaying all the enemies and grabbing the princess and riding off into the sunset, right? And there's something about that captures our imagination and somehow makes this horrific event actually more palatable.
Well, I'm thinking about Viktor Frankl right now, the writer of Man's Search for Meaning. He was a prisoner in Auschwitz, and he found that what humankind needed was not really happiness as much as it was purpose, and that's what they needed. The people who lost hope in Auschwitz literally just died out of hopelessness. And the ones who were able to somehow get a sense of purpose in why they're suffering were able to be resilient and survive.
Yeah, there's something so powerful about that.
So I think that's what it is, right? Storytelling brings purpose into what's happening around you. And that's why, a lot of times I ask people like the symbology or the meaning behind a feeling or a thought. And they don't really know what to say sometimes. And so I change the question. I'll say, hey, so what's the story behind that? And then they will tell me a story from the past that for them is symbolic of what that means to them.
Yeah.
Right. I'm thinking back to Inside Out now, and those little orbs, the core memories, right? that's how we store meaning, is through narratives in our psyche.
Yeah, right. And, we've been talking about collective meaning making, about the folklore, about the histories, and those stories have been crafted and fine tuned sometimes over generations. And sometimes it softens the edges a little bit. Sometimes there's extra added to it. And again, it's the way that we in our present age are taking historical events and shaping them and adding our own meaning to it. I think this is something our generation really enjoys doing. I'm just thinking about like Disney movies, for example. There's stories that were told half a century ago that were completely acceptable. And now we're looking at it and going, that bad guy is too scary for kids. We need to soften it. Or there's language that was used that was completely inappropriate now. So then we have a way of kind of censoring stories and making it appropriate to what is okay now in our current generation. So that's kind of how stories can change over generations and morph into what we need it to mean now.
Yeah, I mean, we have lived in an age of deconstruction. Like I'm a millennial, so I grew up in all of that postmodernism. I don't know where we are now, postmodernism, where it's all about trying to deconstruct what is imposed on us. So you get people who, and nothing wrong with this. I mean, you actually need deconstruction sometimes. But a lot of people are like mad at Hollywood, like, oh, it's just the same stories coming out, the same old formula. Yet, I think there's a reason why that formula is there. It's when you look at the blockbusters, the ones that sell to the masses, there is a formula to it. There's a lot of creativity within the formula, but the formula works. And it's because I think it's hitting something really close to the heart of the human condition, which is why it sparks such a draw when you do follow that formula.
Because there's something in our wiring that we need and want and crave, and that's why we keep watching the movies, and somehow it satisfies us.
Yeah, I mean, there's in all of these movies, there's the hero, right? And then there's the villain. Now, really smart storytelling would see the villain as their own hero of sorts too. They have their own agenda that's in opposing to the hero, and there's a clash between their ideals, and that's why there's a story, right? That's what makes it exciting. If there wasn't a conflict, it'd make a pretty boring movie, and not a lot of people would like it.
Right.
Well, what's neat about all of these stories, though, is that there comes a moment of reckoning, and then there's a resolution of sorts between the two ideals, and it becomes more nuanced. A good story would go through something of that sort because then there's growth and there's character development, right? And this directly ties back to, I think, in therapy too, when we were looking at someone's story. Actually, this happened just yesterday. I was talking to somebody and I was like, this really makes me think about the hero's journey, right? So we talked about that for a little bit, and it was like a fresh perspective on how like the challenges that you're facing is because of these conflicting ideals that you're trying to work out. And so that doesn't diminish how challenging it is, but it does give a sense of meaning or purpose to why I'm challenging it, right? So when you can put yourself into a story in that way, it can help your journey because it frames it as a story.
Yeah, exactly. Our stories are not necessarily as exciting as the epic battles and the lore and that romantic love story necessarily. Sometimes maybe we wish it would be that exciting. But I think in a small way, we're constantly facing this battle of what we want, what we need, and what is really happening. And we kind of have to, face the incongruency a lot of times.
Well, the hobbits do spend a lot of hours on the road just walking and eating food. So, and that stuff is not recorded as detailed because it's not as exciting, right? But it's part of the story.
How do you think the stories that we tell ourselves shape our identity and how we view the world?
Well, I mean, like, I guess I mentioned it earlier, right? Like, our identity is wrapped around our stories. And so how we tell them will completely change our outlook in the world, right? If, for example, a couple of things come to my mind. The first one is if in the story I'm nothing but a victim. Yeah. That'll change completely how I view the world. Or in the story, what if, maybe the opposite is true. I'm the hero of all the situations, right? Then the story becomes really, really frightening and everyone else becomes an enemy. So I guess I'm not really pushing for a right or wrong way per se to look at stories. But like most things, it's more about flexibility. Yeah. It's like, can I see it from different points of view as well? And that's a lot of where when you bring it to a therapy room, that's what's happening, is that you're bouncing back and forth the story narrative, hearing it from someone else's perspective, and then saying, oh yeah, I've seen it that way before. And it is actually shaping your, I guess, the narration of the story in your internal world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's aspects of how we envision our story that tie back to our intersectionality again, our culture, our upbringing. I mean, I mentioned how in the indigenous communities I was in, storytelling was so much part of the fabric of society. It played into conversations. There was an emphasis put on elder storytelling. And if the elder tells you it, then you really, really value that story, right? And maybe above your own if you're a younger person. I'm thinking about how, what was that book? Maybe it was Randy Alcorn's Heaven. He was talking about how in Chinese culture, a lot of times you're thinking in pictures or in stories.
Like rather than statements, right?
Yeah.
Like a visual, there's a visual to it.
Right. And I think in my British upbringing, there's more this Victorian aspect of we're going to do the character description on someone and we're judging people by their upright character. Or, there's different ways that we frame how we think about our story and other people's stories. And some of it is just so integrated into the way we were raised.
Yeah. I mean, like, I, full disclosure, like to read a lot of manga and Korean comics. And I'm always telling people this too, that like, I've read a lot of the Chinese comics, the more recent ones, and like, this just leaves a bad taste in my mouth because the story is the same every single time. And it's about someone who was powerless, suddenly becomes completely overpowered, and then bullies everyone else around him who used to bully them. So there's this narrative there of like, I am the bullied that now has the power to bully others. But, if you're hearing the story everywhere in your culture, that's going to become part of your identity. I mean, I look at it from this perspective too. Like if you look at the political spectrum, you got the right and the left, right? And there's a narrative there. It's very powerful. Facts become very gray. Like everyone's like all the headlines, whether you're on the right side or the left side, are twisted in a way to demonize the other side, and that has real consequences because it causes people to really not like each other. I think one of the narratives, or the underlying narratives for both sides, is that we're the minority here, right? The whole culture is against me. So I got to be really defensive about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw it in a huge way in COVID. It was so divisive because it kind of drew out what people really attach to or what kind of narrative that people are saying to themselves. I think there was kind of we are the majority, why can't you do what everyone else is doing? And then there was we are the minority and we don't want to accept things as fact, that we can't trust the source necessarily. And so there was like this distrust on both, I would say, on the two major sides that were happening. And it went so deep into people's psyche and understanding of their story that it actually pulled families apart and broke lifelong friendships, right?
Yeah. So we buy into narratives. We need to. We want to. Right, we want to be part of, and no one's immune to this. So, right, like I had tried to be as aware of that as possible when I have a conflicting narrative with another person. That I'm like, well, like I really don't see your point of view on this, but I understand that there's a whole world and an ecosystem that you bought into that I need to be aware of. That I also have that on my end, so I need to, at least be very aware of that.
Yeah. I saw this post from a friend last week. It's from the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows by John Koenig. The word that they're defining is sonder, Sonder. And it's the realization that each random passerby is living a life as vivid and complex as your own, populated with their own ambitions, friends, routines, worries, inherited craziness, an epic story that continues invisibly around you, like an anthill sprawling deep underground with elaborate passageways to thousands of other lives that you'll never know existed, in which you might appear only once, as an extra, sipping coffee in the background, as a blur of traffic passing on the highway, or as a lighted window at dusk. I found that really powerful because it just speaks to the way that a lot of times we're so entrenched in our own story that we forget that everyone else has a story too, right? And sometimes in our story, we're the hero and no one else even matters. I remember the year we met, actually, in 2008. There was a guy in university. He subscribed to an ideology called Poohism. And it's not what it sounds like. It's actually Winnie the Poohism, where you're in the center of the world and you can do whatever you want and it's right. And everyone else kind of caters to your needs and wants. And that's how you view the world. It's completely narcissistic. And I think that often becomes a case. We don't all have narcissistic personality disorder, but a lot of times we're so stuck on our own wants and needs and our own story and creating our story or how we interpret our story that a lot of times it detaches us from other people's stories.
Yeah, it's so easy to do. I mean that you'll probably do it today when you are driving and someone cuts you off. You know, oh my goodness, how dare they
Right.
inflict
And
pain on my life?
yeah,
Yeah,
and you're cussing and swearing at them, and meanwhile, their wife's in the passenger seat in labor.
yeah, yeah. No, I love that Sonder. That's a good word. And I think, boy, does that hit you sometimes. I just sometimes think about our children and like, in their life story, I'm not the main character.
Mhm.
I'm the supporting cast. And they have this whole life ahead of them, and they're gonna have drama, and they're gonna have friends that that's gonna love them, and they're gonna love, and they're gonna find significant others. They're gonna, like, they're gonna have a purpose that they're looking for. And it's so wild when I think about that, right? Like this whole other human being, right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing about, talking about how easy it is to dehumanize a person, right? Like, anyone you walk by on the street, anyone that you think negative or hateful thoughts towards, and to in that moment, they've really just a supporting cast in your story, but they have this entire lived experience that is as real as yours.
Yeah.
And that's pretty crazy to ponder or reflect on.
Hmm.
Yeah. And that's, and like you said, that's the very reason that I got attracted into the therapy space,
Right.
because I get invited into those worlds and
Mm.
hear the stories of people, and it still fascinates me. I mean, sometimes you get cynical when you hear stories and themes that repeat, but um, but I think that in general, though, I still, it's a privilege to hear someone's story, and to be invited into that, and to be maybe even a part of it in terms of the narration of it.
Yeah, for sure. Right. And the stories that people are coming in with, it's usually something that's burdening them, troubling them. That's why they're paying for therapy. It's something that they're feeling stuck in or they can't quite work out. What happens when that story that we're telling about our past feels like there's something incomplete or something distorted?
I'm going to use an example, right? Someone once told me that they feel very lost, right? Because they're in this hamster wheel. They have been in a really long time, and in the moment they were off work because of the stress, feeling very defeated by that. It just reminded me of a story, so I shared it with them. I was telling them about these two young men I knew. They were out in Tanzania, and then they got lost. They were trying to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, and this is a real story. So they got lost. They got so dehydrated, one of them actually lost his sight. So he was being guided by the other person who still has their sight. And it got dark, and they said they suddenly saw a light, so they followed it. And then once they got there, the light disappeared and appeared somewhere else, kind of like a will-o-wisp. So what else can I do? It's dark, this dangerous wilderness. I'm just gonna follow the light, right? They did that until they got into this abandoned shed. So it was just a shack. Nobody was there, but there was a fire going and water boiling.
Whoa.
Yeah, yeah. And so they drank water and slept and rested. And then the next day they were able to find help, and they were able to get sent to a hospital and checked on, and found their crew again. So it became the story where I was trying to illustrate, like, hey, I just see that you've been like really lost for a long time. But maybe this is the time when you actually get to finally stop and rest before you find your way again,
Yeah.
right? This period of time. So when you reframe that narrative of where they're at, it gives that purpose, meaning for this specific time. Why am I out of work right now and out on my back and not able to function? Well, you've been holding on to this crazy trauma for your whole life, and it's caught up to you, and now you just need to rest,
Yeah.
right? And that's okay. But yeah, you see how powerful that is, the story.
Right. And I think that nods to the fact that the story we tell ourselves, it's not just a replay of the events that are happening. We're always interpreting it somehow. And then sometimes it's that interpretation that causes us trouble because what's happening doesn't align with our values or expectations, or we feel things are out of our control. There's always more to it than just this is the thing that happened. An example of that, I've known people who have grown up in households where there's all sorts of abuse happening. And out of those children, they might have had a very similar experience of the actual events that happened in their lives. And one child might take it and say, I never want to be like that. I don't ever want my family to experience that. I want to live a life free from this kind of abuse. And that's a really huge motivator in their narrative for them to get the right kind of support so that their family can be free of that kind of abuse. Whereas another individual in that family who may have experienced the exact same events might take it and be crushed by it somehow. And it might lead to addiction or homelessness or repeating that cycle of abuse. So, yeah, again, sometimes it's our interpretation. We're not always doing that willfully or intentionally. It might be the way that we're wired. It might be the way that we have interpreted it all along. And it's so deeply ingrained, it's very hard to get unstuck from that way of thinking.
Yeah, and I think as you're talking, I was just thinking of this too, right? Like, I think there's a reason why a lot of the narrative or exposure therapies get people to actually think about and replay old stories. And it's because there's something about suppression of these stories that are not very healthy. Because you don't get to process or experience the necessary emotions that are supposed to be attached to it. Because they were so overwhelming, it makes sense, right? So my defensive mechanism was to just shut it down and make it disappear. And so you have people with real current issues and they don't know where it's coming from, but it's actually because of those hidden stories within themselves that they refuse to acknowledge. And that's how powerful the mind can be. It can literally erase things, at least from the forefront. Meanwhile, there's a hurting inner child there that is continuing to act out in a behavioral way. Not always the case. You can be very adaptive and move forward without processing old stories. But sometimes when that story is lodged in there, it needs to be explored. Yeah, that's where it becomes in an uncomfortable experiment of coming back to it in order to sort it out.
Yeah, and I think this overlaps a bit with IFS therapy because sometimes you'll ask a client, where is that pain? Like, how old is that pain or that voice that you're hearing? And they'll know immediately that part of me is 12 years old. So then there's always a story there too. So then it's kind of weaving in, IFS, internal family systems. It's a modality where you are asking, the parts of you that are protecting, the parts of you that have adapted to step to the side so that you can speak to that hurting part and then hear their story. And sometimes people are still so much there in their 12-year-old self, even though they're 35 or 45. And so then it's an opportunity to kind of acknowledge the past, but then also bring your story into the present as well.
Yeah. They did this in Suits. There was an episode, spoiler alert for anyone who's
with
watching
Mike Ross.
Yeah, spoiler alert. It was Lewis Litt. Where he had to, and it was because he was in a therapy session, but he actually went in his imagination back to the actual storage room in a gym that he was shoved into and locked inside from the bully. So he went in to comfort the younger version of himself and to face it. That becomes this big, in the storytelling world, this would be called the belly of fish moment, right? Go into the deepest, darkest space. This was his storage room.
Yeah.
That he had to go in and face what was going on there. You see this a lot in the stories. The reason why is because that is how people find resolution with the really dark sides of themselves that are hurting inside, is they need to somehow embrace it.
Like you said, that hurting part of you can sometimes cause distortions. So, I'm thinking of instances where, sadly, I've had many friends who've had one landmark event in their life that has completely changed the course of their history. And it's often where they've had this major hurt from someone. And, now, even though it's maybe a decade or 2 decades later, every story kind of ties back to that story and that event. And it's almost like an hourglass has happened. Can you picture that? So it's like everything that's happening now funnels through that one thing that happened. And if you ask about stories from before that, it's always stories that led up to that in some way. So it becomes the lens that you're viewing your entire story through, is that one awful, horrific event. Like, well, these things happened in my childhood, and that's why this thing then happened. Sometimes a trauma will distort our vision and cloud our vision and kind of take over our entire story. I think what narrative therapy seeks to do is externalize that story a little bit more. So instead of being, this is the thing that happened to me, it's actually, this is the story that I'm telling. This is a story I'm telling myself. So that instead of accepting, this event has changed my entire history, it's instead a way of regaining some control and telling it in a way that externalizes it. So the client is not the problem. I'm not the reason this happened, but this awful thing happened. And so now how do I view my story?
Yeah, I think part of what I'm hearing is that instead of being still in the story, I'm telling the story from outside the story. Like I'm the narrator now of the story. I'm thinking of this particular modality for trauma where we get somebody to write out the story and talk about it, and they draw it out as well. And then the therapist's role is to then say the story back to them, but we use a person point of view. So we say so and so did this and did this and did this, right? Instead of you did this. Or I think two things going on there. One thing is that you are able to actually validate the story and to say this was a horrible thing that happened to so and so.
Yeah.
Right. But on the other hand, you are distancing them from right now to what happened back then. So there's a sense of that happened then, not now.
Yeah.
When they are telling the story, right? So yeah, I think there's a function of that going on where they are becoming the teller of the story rather than living the story at the moment.
Yeah. I think an important thing for our listeners is to understand that we never want to minimize events, right? The pain that happens, because it's real to people. It's horrific or heartbreaking or very distressing. And so we don't want to pretend that it never happened. But I think narrative therapy is a way of approaching it in a safe place and allowing yourself to detach from it a little bit. So it's less about the emotions that are coming up and it's more about the facts. And you're not trying to change the facts either, but sometimes we're trying to see it from a different perspective, right? We're always talking about expanding our view of things that have happened.
Yeah, I think a portion of that is just coming at it from different angles, maybe multiple angles.
Mm-hmm.
And just adding meaning from both sides, right? Like, you have to do it sensitively, obviously. Just yesterday, as I was talking with someone about a challenge they're facing, so we just looked at it from different angles of like, oh, this is a real hurt. Now, what about that from this person's perspective, where they're coming from? And so part of it is challenging some assumptions as well. And I think most people would get this, right? It's like, is it all of this person or is it a part of this person, or is this how they always, those are the kind of things that we want to challenge.
Yeah, the global statements.
So that happens too. But yeah, I mean, the point wasn't to like get to a definitive, this is how you should see things now. It's more of a, let's just look at it from a few different angles and give you something to reflect on and to work out internally that hopefully is a little bit more, I think peaceful is the word I'm using for it. You can make a little bit more peace with what happened here.
Exactly. Yeah. No, and I'm thinking about how, yeah, I mean, yesterday I was chatting with a friend who was going through something that was disturbing or distressing, and she was sharing how she had already talked to another friend about that. And I think naturally, in some ways, if we have people in our lives that we trust, we will retell that story and then we'll hear their feedback and we'll shift our story a little. And then we'll retell it to someone else and hear their feedback and we might shift a little bit. And we do that until somehow we've made peace or it calms us down.
That's right.
That's why we need community. And, we also get that from our therapist. Our therapist might have different tools that our friends aren't able to offer, or, they might be able to use different therapeutic research-driven approaches. Yeah. So, I mean, we're trying to give a balanced view here. We're not just saying you need therapy to deal with your story. A lot of times you're kind of doing it naturally by sharing it with other people. I think the hard thing is when it's a piece of your story that you feel shame about, or when you feel it's the people closest to you that have caused it maybe, and there's no one you can trust anymore. And a lot of times that's what drives people to therapy. Or when you're just out of ideas. And that's when we're here to help. Like I said, this is part 1 of a 2-part series. And in the second part, we're going to dive more into the therapy room with narrative therapy and talk about different therapeutic approaches that your practitioner might use and how they might help you to reframe your story. This is Beyond the Session, brought to you by Reset Counseling and Psychotherapy in Barrie. If you have any questions about what you heard on the air today, please email us at resetbarrie@gmail.com, and we'll see you for the next show.